So, let's say you have an established business. In previous videos, we stated that you need to master your business. Pick one thing and perfect it. Well, what if that one thing you sell is not a good thing to sell? What if your product is actually a bad product to sell to the government? How would you know? Would you even know? There's this term in FAR Part 8 called mandatory sources. Think of it like a hierarchy of sellers that the government must go through before it solicits to the commercial market. Before Big Daddy government shops for goods in the commercial market, they try to get a better deal from these mandatory sources. Why you should steer clear of mandatory source items. If the government is required to purchase from these sources, your chances of winning a contract for these items are significantly reduced. For instance, if you're offering furniture or textiles, these products may be covered under a program that forces the agency to buy elsewhere before the commercial market. In such cases, the government is likely to turn to these mandatory sources first, rendering your bid irrelevant. This is why you should focus on items and services that are not restricted by mandatory source requirements, or ensure that their offerings are distinct enough to fall outside of these regulations. For supplies, the government will look to sources like Federal Prison Industries, FPI, also known as UNICOR, and the Ability One program. Only if these sources are unavailable to meet the government's needs can the procurement move to other options such as the commercial market for services. Similar to supplies, certain services must be sourced from designated programs with a preference given to Ability One when applicable. The far part that you see on screen tells you where to find this information. There are mandatory sources for both services and commodities, but let's talk about commodities first. We'll think of a scenario. Pretend we are the US Army and we are searching for new IT equipment for our offices. Computers, routers, cables, etc. Number 1. The very first source that we should look at is ourselves. Does Army Logistics have spare IT equipment for us anywhere? If it does, we can acquire it and save the Army thousands of dollars. If it doesn't, well, we'll have to move to the second source, excess from other agencies. So we know the Army doesn't have IT equipment, but does the Navy have IT equipment? Does the Department of Labor have IT equipment? Does the NSA have IT equipment? This is where we have to do our due diligence and look at other agencies and purchase from them. Why would we buy from the hardworking American people when we can buy at a discount from the US government? After all, this equipment will just sit there collecting dust, and it's taxpayer funded, and we never waste taxpayer dollars. Let's say no other agency wants to sell us their IT equipment. Our third mandatory source, the FPI, Federal Prison Industries. Some federal prisons are able to produce manufactured goods from prisoners at little to no cost, as if slavery was still legal. These same products are then sold to the government at little to no cost. Knowing that IT equipment takes more than just labor to produce, it's safe to assume that there are no prisoners out there manufacturing computers and routers, but it's worth an ask. No luck. Wholesale supply sources. Up to this point, we have exhausted all of our previous options to buy IT equipment for the US Army. Our next source is wholesale supply. Think of Costco, but for the federal government. Wholesale supply sources means the government agencies have already established contracts with private companies, and they let other agencies use these contracts to purchase commodities. A good example of this is GSA, the General Service Administration. This large contract is open to government agencies for them to use whenever they need to make a purchase. All of these are mandatory sources for commodities. But what about services? Well, mandatory sources are a lot easier for services. There's only one. Nonprofit agencies employing people who are blind or severely disabled. A common one is the Ability One program, the government's procurement process. When a federal agency needs to purchase goods or services, it checks the mandatory sources. Here's how the process really works. Number 1. First, they identify the requirement. The agency identifies its specific needs for goods or services. Number 2, they check the mandatory source. Before issuing a solicitation like an RFP or an RFQ, the contracting officer first checks if the item, need, or service is available from UNICOR or Ability 1. Number 3, determine availability. If the product or service is available and meets the government's needs in terms of price, quality, and delivery time frame, the agency must purchase from the mandatory source. Notice the term must. They have no option. They have to buy from the mandatory source. Number 4, proceed to other sources. If the mandatory source cannot meet the requirements, the agency may then consider other sources such as GSA. 5, open market. If the agency still cannot find a reliable seller, then they turn to the commercial market for any sellers, which is you, the contractor. You're 5 on the list, the very last one, which again explains why you should stay away from mandatory sourced items. So what if we can't find a source for IT equipment in agency inventories, other agency inventories, federal prison industries, the blind and disabled agencies, or GSA? Well, then and only then we are allowed to purchase from the commercial market. This is why I'll tell you over and over to stay away from items that will fall under mandatory source. It becomes very difficult to land business if the government is required to go to other sources first. So before you decide to go ahead and focus on selling your product, ask yourself, will the government purchase this from the commercial market? Do I even have a shot at winning this contract?